Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Books I'm Reading Right Now podcast. I'm your host, Caden, and this is a podcast about the books I'm reading, where after I'm finished reading the book, I go ahead and I talk about the book, and you get to go ahead and listen to me talk about the book that I was reading. The book that we're talking about today is a dissertation written in 1980 called The Early and Middle Helladic Periods in Elis by Margarita Elis. Before I begin talking about the contents of the book and what I learned, I would like to talk about where I found the book and where I physically read the book. I found the book on JSTOR while I was looking for archaeological analysis papers on the late Helladic period in Greece, specific to Elis and Achaea. When I found this title, I downloaded it for later reading. I thought that this was an archaeological paper, and I was wrong. It is a 250-page long dissertation. That didn't deter me, however, and I began reading it slowly, taking it chunk by chunk, until I finally finished it some 2 months after I began it. I was in several locations while I was reading this. I read it on my breaks at work. I read it while I was out and about at restaurants. I remember reading like 10 pages at a Denny's once. And I finished it while sitting on a lawn chair, waiting for my girlfriend to finish up her horse riding lessons for that day. As I do with any ancient historical text that I read, I kept an email chain for my notes, and luckily I was able to pull heavily from those today. Now, having gone through where I found the book and the places I read the book, I would like to go ahead and talk about why I read the book. My reasons for searching for this material began with dissatisfaction from another book. After reading the Oxford Handbook of the Bronze Age Aegean, I felt a little disappointed about some of the geographical aspects of its scope. I felt like the early Helladic and middle Helladic periods weren't covered very well at all. I felt that the regions of Thessaly, Achaea, Arcadia, and Elis were left wanting. I felt like several important sites, like Philacopy, weren't present in the book when they should have been. So, I went on to go search for more information on these regions myself. That's how I ended up on JSTOR and finding the dissertation. Now, whenever I discuss my reasoning behind researching things, there's always the reason, and that's what you just heard. And then there's a more obscure reason, which is a little harder to explain, but I'll go ahead and give it my best go here. So this was a bit of a research rabbit hole I've been working on surrounding the real-life sites which surround Greek mythology, and trying to see if I can spot archaeological events or realities that might have inspired the mythical past. So my search for early, middle, and late Helladic Elis is directly tied to that search for these archaeological events. There's a king in Greek mythology known as Pelops. He was the ruler of the city of Pisa, a city-state in the region of Elis in the eastern Peloponnese. He's an important figure in Greek mythology because nearly all of the royal lineages that matter during the epic cycle, which is that period of time when the Greeks fought the Trojans, can be traced back to him. When I was reading the Oxford Handbook of the Bronze Age Aegean, I was making an attempt to create a catalogue of the Greek myths in order. Not from the archaeology, of course. That was a separate intellectual curiosity. I was compiling those from the ancient poets and playwrights. My curiosity toward the foundation of these Greek myths from the archaeological record was birthed from, but is separate from, this chronological cataloging project. I've learned that this is a fool's errand and that nobody should ever do it, and they shouldn't try it, and even though I know this, I'm still trying to do it, so you can laugh at me if you want. It's completely warranted and valid if you do so. But I wanted to know where, if at all, that kingdom of Pisa fit into the larger narrative of mythology, because in my mind, why would there be a myth about a Greek kingdom if that site didn't even exist? I took the archaeologist's word for it, though, that Pisa didn't exist, and wanted to know if there was something else in the region of Elis that might explain why the Greeks remembered a powerful kingdom once dominating the Peloponnese from there. I figured I could maybe get a basic understanding of how the myth formed. So I perused JSTOR and came across Margarita Elis' dissertation and downloaded it for later reading. I thought it would be a research article. It was not a research article. I got over 200 pages of text and another 250 of images. After reading it, I have to say I feel a lot more confident about my knowledge of the early and middle Helladic periods in Elis. And I'm even certain I understand where that ancient kingdom of Pelops might have been, and how the reality of that polity's rule may have been different from its mythological counterpart. I'll talk about those findings at the end of the episode. For now, the last part of the introduction needs to be an introduction of Margarita Elis. I couldn't find any up-to-date information on her. She might work for the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel as an archaeologist. That's all from an old affiliation record, and I have no idea where her career has taken her in the modern day. She has publications on JSTOR, academia.edu, and researchgate.net. I searched through some of her academia.edu uploads, and they're mostly papers on the Stone Age, the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. And I ultimately think this became her line of study after she wrote this dissertation 46 years ago. She doesn't publish any materials on the Bronze Age anymore. Finally, after that abnormally long introduction, we can go ahead and begin to talk about the book itself. The scope of the book covers the early Helladic II, III, and the entire Middle Helladic periods in the region of Elis in the early and Middle Bronze Ages, covering a time period from about 2650 to 1550 BC. Going chapter by chapter wouldn't be very productive in this review, so I'll instead focus on the contents of the book when I'm discussing the things that I learned. The entire topic was fairly new to me, so I learned a lot. And obviously, a lot didn't end up being retained at all. It's me we're talking about. Whenever I read something like this, I tend to focus on the changes in objects and sites, and pay less attention to what the objects actually are and what their functions might be. My research going into this was, after all, looking for the Kingdom of Pisa. I was open to other information, but a lot of the book is just pottery shards, and they are fascinating pottery shards, and I've learned a lot about pottery shards, but I wasn't looking for pottery shards. In fact, despite what I'm going to tell you throughout the majority of this podcast, the pottery shards take up the majority of the book. I just don't know what to say about them. For basic reference, if you're looking to read this book, Chapter 2 takes place with the Early Helladic II period, Chapter 3, the Early Helladic III period, Chapter 4, the Middle Helladic period. Chapter 1 is an introduction, and Chapter 5 is a summary and conclusion. There's also an appendix at the end, including a catalog of sites and a chronological table. Included in the appendix is also a set of maps. Lastly, I want to talk about the pictures. There are 250 pages worth of plates. That's the term used for images referenced within an academic text in the middle or end of a book. I'm sure in the original version of Margarita's dissertation, the plates were incredible, detailed, and even stunning. But in the version I got, the scanned version, which appears on JSTOR, the only two colors that appear on the page are black and white with nothing in between. That made it really funny when I saw a picture that said, "Here's a view of the Alpheus Valley," and it was just a black square. I got a good laugh out of that. I showed a coworker, and he got a good laugh out of it too. That makes it 2 for 2 on the people that think the black square is funny club, which in my mind is enough to confirm that it is, in fact, really funny. I don't have anything to say about the plates. I clearly didn't see what they had on them. The ones that I could make out clearly were drawings of certain types of pottery. It's nice to know what minyanware looks like, literally exactly what you'd think of when you think of ancient Greek pottery. But it's also nice to know what a sauce boat looks like from the early Helladic II period. It's almost exactly what you might envision it looks like, but it's probably taller than what you're thinking. They were probably an important cultural marker. I'm sure they were an important religious marker. They might have even been used practically. Once again, understanding sauce boats wasn't my objective. That's all pottery shards to me, and that will not be the focus of what I discuss here today. So, transitioning from all of that, we've got to talk about what I, Caden, the host, learned from this wonderful dissertation. I've decided instead of talking about it by chapter, I was going to split it up by era, because sometimes certain eras are discussed between different chapters to signify a change. I have de-scrambled everything in the text and pushed them together into their appropriate eras for both my and your sake. So let's begin. The first section is on the Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Early Helladic I periods. The Paleolithic and Neolithic eras were technically beyond the scope of Elis's dissertation, but she still spoke a bit about these eras, so I'll make a short mention of them. Populations persisted in Elis from the Paleolithic through to the Neolithic period. The population which inhabited the land during the time of the Neolithic didn't see any cultural change when the rest of the Aegean switched over to the Early Helladic I period. They, however, did join in on the Early Helladic II phase, basically meaning that they skipped out entirely on that first phase of Early Helladic cultural development. The Early Helladic II culture was an interesting one to read about. I think I learned and found myself most fascinated by this specific culture while I was reading the dissertation. And I think I know why. It's because it's a fully fledged civilization that I've never heard of before. It's rare when a person who has studied history all their life gets the pleasure of learning about a brand new civilization, especially these days. There's only so many, and then eventually you run out of countries and regions and names, and you just start to read derivative works instead, getting more details about what you already know about. So learning about something entirely new was incredible. I remembered I got so excited, I sent audio messages to people, I spoke about it to my friends at the bar, I yapped about this at 1 a.m. to a friend while we were playing Helldivers one night. One of the coolest parts about this early Helladic 2 civilization is that it's not Greek. The people groups that would migrate into Greece, the Indo-European speaking groups that eventually became Greeks, hadn't even migrated into the region yet. That's cool. I think it's cool to see a pre-Greek civilization in Greece. This also corroborates to some extent with Greek mythological migration myths and corresponds loosely with the later Luwian migrations in Anatolia. And none of that is within the scope of the dissertation. I'm just nerding out. Maybe I can eventually make something about that topic in a separate podcast, not a books podcast. But for now, anytime that I feel the need to nerd out and go beyond the scope of this book, I will. That's just what's going to happen. The people of the early Helladic II period lived in rectangular houses in urbanized settlements. The people of Elis, as with all the people in the early Helladic II period, were influenced by the nearby early Cycladic Keros-Syros culture, probably due to its economic ties. Once again, another tangent. The trade that was coming from the Eastern civilizations would have come through the Cyclades by raft or canoe, because as far as I'm aware, the trade ship, the actual means of constructing a real boat through wooden planks, hadn't been invented yet. And the easy pass through the Cycladic islands would have made several of the villages, towns, and cities there incredibly prosperous by the amount of wealth flowing through them, and by proxy through the Aegean. So, as they were exporting these foreign goods into the Helladic mainland, they were also exporting their culture, as well as importing some from the Middle East. That importation of Middle Eastern culture was probably the religious figurine. The people in the region of Elis were either adopting the Keros-Syros cultural and religious customs, or at least their figurines, which are known to be widespread throughout the eastern Levant, and were perhaps imported from the Phoenician coast or somewhere thereabouts into the Aegean. The Cycladic Keros-Syros traders seemed to travel wherever there was a coast in Greece, which meant that the people of Elis were attached to the same Aegean trade network as the other major sites, like the one at Lerna, a major early Helladic site in the Argolid that I'm not going to discuss right now. There were also locally made imitation Keros-Syros figurines, even found as far in as Arcadia. Arcadia is to the east of the region of Elis, to the west of the Argolid. It is the mountainous center of the Peloponnese, which would typically be isolated from sea trade. So Cycladic influence is evident throughout the Peloponnese. And furthermore, it shows that during the early Helladic II period, the region of Elis, and maybe even the region of Arcadia, were directly connected to the Cycladic trade network. This early Helladic II culture came to an abrupt and violent end, however, due to a heavy influx of migrants from the north. These migrants were the Greeks, or at least the people who became the Greeks. These Greeks were an amalgamation of southward moving tribes from the Baden, Kodafeni, and Chernovoda cultures. This is an edit I'm recording for this podcast because I felt like it would be rude to tell you that the Greeks were made of itinerant groups from the Baden, Kodafeni, and Chernovoda cultures without telling you a little bit about who those cultures are, where they were located, and when they existed. The Chernovoda culture is first. It was located along the Danube River and the Bulgarian coast, and it flourished around 4000 to 3200 BC. The Kodafeni culture was next. It was west of the Chernovoda culture in modern-day Romania and Bulgaria, with its furthest southern extent reaching the Danube River. It thrived from 3500 to 2500 BC. The Baden culture existed in southwest Germany, near Poland, stretching down into the Balkans. It was the furthest west of these three cultures mentioned, and it was thought to have lasted from about 3520 to 2690 BC. And I want to give you a little heads up, a little warning. I got these dates from Wikipedia, so take them with a grain of salt. These people intermingled in or around Macedonia and Thessaly, and eventually this Koine culture of several different people groups used overland routes to migrate into the lands of Greece. This happened around the year 22 to 2100 BC, approximately around the same time that the Akkadian Empire and the Egyptian Old Kingdom fell. So here's another one of my tangents where I'll talk about things that weren't in the book, and this will be speculation time. What I'm about to say isn't really a part of any major academic study, but it's my own ramblings based on some cursory research that I've done. It's not academic, so take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt. During this time period, from 22 to 2100 BC, the entire world went through some kind of climate change. I don't know much about the fall of the Akkadian Empire other than that the Gutian invasion happened, but I do know that in Egypt the river floods were reaching all-time lows when the Old Kingdom collapsed. Furthermore, all the way in Manchuria, the Liao River civilization went through a period of collapse as the lands desertified, and many people from that region migrated south to the Yellow River, mixing with the populations there and eventually founding the fabled Xia dynasty. Maybe all this migration and collapse was linked together by a larger culprit, as I'm claiming climate change. The YouTube channel Dig Archaeology has a video titled The First Bronze Age Collapse and the Intermediate Bronze Age, which covers this topic to some degree over the course of less than 20 minutes. I'd recommend it. I recommend everything on that channel. Love that channel. Glaze in that channel. I will glaze that channel until the day I die. Now we can move on to the early Helladic III period. The burned, destroyed, and abandoned buildings of the early Helladic II culture show the sheer scope of devastation that these people went through. Yet the violence didn't kill off all the original inhabitants of the region. Rather, some of them continued living there, and some probably migrated elsewhere. While I'm certain that many of the early Helladic II population were enslaved by the Greeks, some of them probably moved into the Arcadian highlands. Population groups in general seemed to travel uphill at this time, settling in places that were easier to defend. This is once again a place where I'm going to stop and speculate. I have this headcanon that the Pelasgian Azanians of Greek mythology, as mentioned in Pausanias, migrated over to Anatolia, where their descendants eventually established the kingdom of Arzawa, later known as the Kingdom of Asia. I don't have any direct archaeological evidence for this. It's just from a note in Pausanias talking about the city of Azan migrating over to a place where a certain cave is, and that cave happens to be in Anatolia. Alright, back to Cuzumelis's book. It was in the early Helladic III period that places like the Altis at Olympia were founded. The houses were apsidal in nature, which means a rectangular building with a semicircle at one end. The stone and mud brick of the early Helladic II period were replaced by houses of reeds, mud plaster, and river pebbles. The early Helladic III also saw an influx of itinerant people groups who didn't settle down in one spot and who moved around looking for work. The early Helladic III style of architecture continued and soon solidified. The materials got better, but the architecture remained the same. It appeared that Elis, like the rest of Greece, firmly fell into the advancements of early Helladic III and the Middle Helladic culture. Now moving on to the Middle Helladic period. The Middle Helladic period, despite it lasting for 500 years, is poorly documented. This isn't just a trend associated with the Aegean, but the Middle Bronze Age more broadly. The reasons are many. The population heavily decreased after the collapse of the early Helladic II culture, so there would be less sites early on that could take shape. The population heavily decreased after the collapse of the early Helladic II culture. On top of that, after these new sites were settled, the populations in these settlements began to increase. Without a dramatic collapse and fires to harden permanent fossils of buildings for us to discover, the Middle Helladic culture's materials simply didn't end up coming to us preserved. These resources were instead utilized and exhausted over time by a healthy and growing population and a rapidly budding new culture. It was in this period that the prototype for Greek pottery, minyanware, was born. That's minion spelled M-I-N-Y-A-N, named after the Orchomenian king, Minyas. Minyanware became the defining pottery type during the Mycenaean period, and we see several variants in Elis, suggesting that this area may have been where this type of ware was first produced, before it became popular and spread to the rest of Greece. In this Middle Helladic period, specifically in the Middle Helladic II and III periods, circa 1900 to 1650 BC, the settlements in the region of Elis really coalesced around one specific area. This area was near Olympia, and our author believed that the fabled city of Pisa, the city which Pelops once ruled from, was nearby. It would have been a little ways away from where the Olympian Altis was, atop a hill which is now, as far as I'm aware of, a farm. I couldn't pinpoint the exact spot on Google Earth, but the area that I think it is a farmstead. And this whole region wasn't one continuous city, but it was a series of small, closely settled sites of human habitation. Eventually, like the rest of Greece, Elis entered the late Helladic period, and this period saw the relevance of Elis diminish compared to the ever-expanding states surrounding it, like the kingdom of Pylos, or of Mycenae, or of Athens, or of Thebes, or of Orchomenos, really anywhere. Elis basically became a backwater at this time. But Elis never became removed from the Aegean world, and they stayed connected with the trade network until the collapse of the Helladic period. I make that point specifically because I've read some scholars who claim that Elis, Achaea, and Arcadia were peripheral to the Aegean world and their trade networks, which means that they weren't directly trading with the Aegeans, but trading with certain Aegeans or through secondary sources to receive Aegean products. I just wanted to point out that from Elis's research, this doesn't seem to be the case. Now let's talk about the key takeaways from this book. Elis was always a part of the Aegean network. It was not peripheral, nor was it unimportant, as some scholars have suggested. The city of Pisa was probably real, but perhaps likened more to the way Thucydides describes Sparta. A not-so-tightly packed settlement which, like Sparta, would leave no trace behind that it was once a great city. Pisa's history matters very little, if at all, in the later myths of the epic cycle after the death of Pelops. This can probably be credited to the growing importance of the other sites and regions at the expense of Elis, Arcadia, and Achaea. I haven't read much on those regions, save for whatever Pausanias wrote, so having a long period of time when Pisa wasn't historically important makes sense. Elis makes an interesting claim in the introduction of her work. During the transition from the Middle to the Late Helladic period, the city-state of Pylos conquered the land on which Olympia was occupied, and they ruled over that land until Pylos was destroyed around 1200 BC. If Pisa simply got eclipsed by her neighbors, maybe her population moved out of the area and spread around throughout broader Elis. And that area, by the time that Pylos conquered it, probably wasn't even the capital of the kingdom operating in that region anymore. It would explain why we don't have a myth on the destruction of Pisa, as far as I'm aware. Now I want to talk about what my potential finding is for the kingdom of Pelops. Within this dissertation was a map, displaying a group of sites around a specific point. This site map shows an extremely dense set of settlements around Olympia compared to those around other sites. Perhaps this area was the city of Pisa. Maybe it was a coalition of small, closely settled towns which, when their forces were combined, proved to be very formidable. I believe this set of towns dominated the region, and I think it is this set of towns that is remembered as the Kingdom of Pisa. My script says after this that I should let the listener go and that they can make their own pottery shards, which is funny because I didn't mention pottery shards much at all in this episode. But like I said previously, the dissertation is full of them. I would recommend this dissertation to anybody that's interested in the early and middle Helladic periods in Elis, the early and middle Helladic periods generally, or is really interested in those pottery shards. The last word of my script here says toodles, and I don't think I've ever said that word out loud before, until now. Toodles.